All right, good morning. It is time for us to begin. I heard the bell, so it's time to go. We're going to begin in Esther Chapter 6 here in just a moment. We're glad for you to be here this morning, and thank you so much for making it a priority to be here in Bible class. Hope this is instructive for you, and the principles and the lessons that we glean are certainly applicable to our lives. We're glad for those of you who are joining us online. Thank you so much for making a point to be with us. We have handouts, a copy of the outline in the auditorium here present. They're back here on this either side. But for those of you watching at home, if you'd like a copy of what we're talking about, either in note format or in the skeleton outline, you can send me an email at graberpreacher@gmail.com or the church office at graber.rd@gmail.com. Only it necessitates that you understand how to spell the word Graber. I find in the office it's funny how many things come in Graber, and it's anyway. But Grae, A is before the E, except after G. Yes, sir. Don't be talking about you, not knowing how to spell Graber. Well, all somebody has to do is try and spell Christopolis, and we see that we're vastly undermatched. So there you go. All right, let's get off of spelling. Let's get on to Bible. How about that? Otherwise, we'll have a spelling bee between me and George, and you're going to find out that, yeah, I lost. No, I'll win. Rebecca says I'll win, so there you go. Glad for you to be here this morning. Let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into our class study. God in heaven, thank you so much for this day and for the beauty of it. We're thankful for a nice, cool, air-conditioned building, for padded pews, for Bibles in each lap that we can open up and we can study more about who you want us to be and about the people, Father, that are worthy of invitation and the people that are not worthy of invitation. God, we're thankful so much for the book of Esther, that even though you are not mentioned at all, we know, Father, that your fingerprints are everywhere. And Father, even though this world may not mention you at all, God, we know that your fingerprints are everywhere, that you're active in this world, that you're concerned about the course of it, that you're concerned about your people, that you're concerned, Father, with the lost. And may we share that concern, and may we be every day evangelistically minded and looking out, Father, for opportunities to share who you are, share what you've done, and the greatness, Father, of your salvation through Jesus Christ. We're thankful for the church that meets here. We're mindful, Father, of those who have been mentioned in the past and that are currently suffering and hurting, going through difficult times. We pray a blessing upon them and blessing upon us, Father, as we strive and minister to them and encourage them. And may you be honored and glorified through our efforts. And may the lost and may the downtrodden and may the discouraged understand the love that exists here and realize, Father, that as we plead with them, that they can do it, that they can make it through, and that they have you and that they have us and they have your word. God, may it be that they're encouraged, they take heart, and they continue doing what's right. We're so thankful, Father, for the book of Esther, and we pray that you'd open our eyes to behold wonderful things from it. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All righty-o, as we get started, let's remind ourselves of the purposes of the book, and I haven't asked you to do these things. We could do it Acts style, but we're not going to. We've got just a couple of weeks left. This is Acts Chapter 6. We've got 7, 8, and then 9 and 10 will be done together, and we do have a break in between there where Jesse Stewart, one of the students from the School of Preaching that we support at Southwest, is going to be coming and delivering Bible class and then both sermons. But for our purposes this morning, reminding ourselves about the book of Esther. Purpose of the book is, number one, to understand and explain the origin of the Feast of Purim. Feast of Purim, the feast that the Jews celebrate, and even Jesus celebrated this feast. If you look at the book of John, you'll ascertain the proper time period, but the Feast of Purim, where they celebrate the downfall of the enemies of the Jews and the exaltation of the Jews over their enemies. Number two, you find that there's a conflict in worldview between the godly and the ungodly. And one of those things is going to come through that even though, again, the Word of God or God is not mentioned at all in this epistle or in this chronology, this narrative, you find that there are two different worldviews that are contrasted here in the book of Esther. Beginning of Esther chapter 3 and verse 8. Haman said to the king Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all your provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other people's. They do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain." All right? People looking from the outside can't understand why we do what we do. People looking from the outside can only see surface level things and perhaps understand that we're just different. We're not like them. Peter would say in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, you're God's own special people, that he's called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Because we're not children of darkness anymore, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, or 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, because we're not children of darkness anymore, the world looks at us and says, we don't understand, we don't get it. Why in the world would you do something different than the course of this world? You see that very clearly here in Esther chapter 3 and verse 8. There is also the theocentric worldview. Theocentric worldview. I know God is working in this world. Deists claim that God wound this world up just like a watchmaker winds up the watch, and then he's not concerned about it. Or a divine shipbuilder. He built this world, he pushed it out to sea, and he has no more dealings with it. That's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is active, and he's concerned about this world and certainly about his people within it. And that's why Mordecai was able to tell Esther, Esther, you've got to go in before the king. You've got to go. And she says, well, I haven't been called in 30 days. He says, well, you need to go in. She says, if I go in and I'm not bidden, then that could cost me my life. And he says, chapter 4, verse 14, good key verse for this book, if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish, yet who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And thus we see that God is working even when he can't be seen. There is a principle of providence all through the book of Esther. Once again, God is not mentioned at all, either by name or by reference. We're going to trust in him. We're going to pray to him. You're going to find that there are a number of times where it would be absolutely necessary for us to look and say, well, the Jews were obviously fasting and praying for Esther before she went in with the king. The Jews were obviously fasting and praying whenever they heard that there was a decree that was going to allow the non-Jews to wipe them out. But there is not a single mention of those things. And yet just because God, his name, is absent from this book doesn't give us the right to say, well, God is just absent. And so you find in Esther a principle of providence even within the restoration time period where the Jews were allowed to come back into Israel. Chapter 6 is really the turning point in the whole narrative. And I mentioned this briefly last week, but this is something that's very, very important because Chapter 6 and verse 1, I believe, is the absolute turning point of this story. Up until now, you have things going in a direction where Haman is going to get his way, where Haman's going to have the opportunity where he's going to be able to eradicate the Jews. Of course, Esther has the banquets for the king, or for the single banquet in chapter 5, and she's about to have another one here on the day of chapter 6 taking place. But the turning point of this, where God begins to exalt the humble and humble the exalted, is beginning with a sleepless night of the king. We're going to read through chapter 6 and come back and make some observations as we've always done, or as we've done throughout this study, and then make some applications at the very end with regard to principles that we can see. Chapter 6, verse 1, please. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. You may write the cross-reference chapter 2. That's all at the end of chapter, was it chapter 1 or chapter 2? Chapter 2, end of chapter 2. That night the king, then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's servants who attended him said, nothing's been done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the court, the outer court of the king's palace, to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. The king's servants had said to him, well, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man to whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, well, who would the king delight to honor more than me? Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn. Let a horse which the king has ridden, and which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and this horse be delivered to the hand of one king's most noble princes, that he may array the man to whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback throughout the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man who the king delights to honor. And the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe, take the horse, as you suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gates. Leave nothing undone of all that you've spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done to the man to whom the king delights to honor. Afterwards Mordecai went back to the king's gates, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, If Mordecai, before whom you've begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will surely not prevail against him, but you shall surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Queen Esther had prepared. A number of things about this already. But we're going to title this lesson, Warning Lights on the Way to Disaster. And we're going to start out with chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, a night of discovery. Chapter 6, verse 1, as we just mentioned, begins with the king having a sleepless night. Some nights you just can't. It could be that he was disturbed about the request of Esther. There could be something else that was going on in his kingdom, but sometimes sleep just seems to escape. Shakespeare once said, Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown, and that may be true, just the king dealing with stresses and issues that we have no concept of. What does a king choose for his entertainment? What does he choose to soothe him back to sleep? Let's have something red. And what are we going to choose that might put me to sleep faster than anything else? Bring the records and bring the law books. I want the records of the Chronicles. Thus did so-and-so do for so-and-so. And thus did this person and that person. And in the year 2093, you have this person doing to that person. Doesn't take long, does it? Something as dry, perhaps, as the law to put him right to sleep. Chronicles of the Persians were, as some would claim, entertaining and instructive. They were composed by the best poets in the empire, but for whatever reason, the king said, I want to talk about the Chronicles. I want to find the book of the Chronicles. The servant goes, and which book does he choose? What's the occasion, and what's the notable record that just happens to be in the book that he picks up? It's a story about Mordecai telling or informing on the two eunuchs in the king's gates that were going to try and lay hands on the king and put him to death. Isn't it interesting that it just happens, number one, that the king had a sleepless night, number two, that he just happened to ask for the books of the law, and number three, that the servant just happened to go and grab this specific volume that had to do with Mordecai taking care of a plot against the king's life. And now this is about 5 years removed after that, about 5 years removed after Mordecai had informed. Verses 2 and 3 is found written in Mordecai told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs and doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on him. King said, What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai? The king's servants who attended him said, Nothing has been done for him. There's something wrong. There's a missing part of the story. Servant, I think you left it out. Did you skip over something? Sometimes I do that whenever I'm reading along and wait, how did we get here? And you realize you skipped a paragraph or perhaps you skipped a key sentence. What's the resolution, the king asks? Where's the honor that goes to Mordecai? And they said, well, that's not in there. Nothing has been done for him. So the king, with his sleepless night, now needs a royal advisor. Who does he look for? All right. He asks the question, who's in the king's gates, or who's inside the king's house? And what do they say? Well, Haman's just arrived. Isn't it strange? Isn't it coincidental that Haman, of all people, is now first in line and coming into the king's presence? It's kind of like, again, in a way, what did the Jews do with Pilate whenever they were wanting to put Jesus to death? When did they come to him? Anybody remember? They came early in the morning. I kind of wonder if they got Pilate out of the bed in order to try and ask for Jesus to be crucified. Very first thing in the morning, they weren't wasting time. They had the trial overnight. They had Jesus awake, and this midnight kangaroo court that they'd offered, but just as soon as the first light began to break, they were there in the presence of Pilate asking for Jesus to be crucified. What's Haman doing? What's he going to ask for? Mordecai to be hanged on the gallows. And how tall were the gallows? All right, 50 cubits, about 75 feet tall. All right, he's built these gallows, and now he's just got to get permission. Honey, I tell you what, I'm going to go first thing in the morning to the king's house. I'm going to wait, and the first thing that he does when he gets up groggy and bleary-eyed, I'm going to say, hey, are you okay if I hang Mordecai the Jew? Yeah, sure, go ahead, no problem. Whatever, I trust your judgment, go right ahead. I used to, of course, be a public school teacher, and I used to think that if we could get the kids up, and get them in school about 6:30 and be done by noon, it would be a whole lot better because they would be, just sitting there in the seats and just kind of, all right, here's what we got to learn. Let's learn this today. Let's learn this today, as opposed to, awake and got some sugar in them and mouthing off and stuff. Anyway, but the king decides, okay, I need a royal advisor. There's Haman that just happens to come in. And who do we have first thing in the morning? He's there, and Haman is on the cusp of the best day ever, isn't he? Oh, he gets to have another banquet with the queen today. And yesterday I had this gallows built that was 75 feet tall, and it's only going to be a short time before we institute this day. The king says, let Haman come in. He hastened to come, and there's no wait time to see the king. Hey, there's not a queue that I've got to get past. I'm first in line this morning. That's exactly what I wanted, and that's even better. So that morning of decision is now here. Morning of decision, chapter 6, verses 6 through 10. Here's a simple question. Haman, before you tell me what you need to tell me, I got a question for you. Before we get to other business, the murder of the person that you want to murder, what's to be done for the man to whom the king delights to honor? Kind of an odd question first thing in the morning, especially before you've even had your coffee, right? Haman, what is he thinking at this time? This probably has something to do with Esther inviting me to a royal banquet and already having attended a royal banquet. And I know I've got the king's ear, and I know everything is sunshine and roses for me. Who would the king delight to better honor more than me? Boy, I really deserve it, don't I? Isn't that a wonderful thing? I better think of something good. And so what does he think of? What does he think of? All right, here's a pompous answer. I got to make this good. Let me see. Royal robe. Royal robe which the king has worn. There's something that's delightful. Royal horse on which the king has ridden, with a royal crest placed upon his head. And let's not stop there. Let's have a guy who's a royal prince that's now going to pull this horse around the city square, and a royal proclamation to be made. Thus shall it be done to whom the king delight to honor. Sorry, I messed that up. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. That's a whole lot of words. I apologize. Haman's going big, or he's going home. And he actually goes home after this. He asks for a lot because who is he expecting this to be done for? Himself. That's exactly right. And the surprising twist is there in verse 10. He says, go. Hurry, take that robe, take that horse as you suggest, and do for Mordecai the Jew who sits in the king's gates. Leave nothing undone of all that you've said. What are you thinking about if you're Haman at this point? You know what? What is he thinking? I would think, maybe I misheard. Wait, what? What are you talking about? And can you imagine him there with this delight and this being on cloud nine, and then all of a sudden hearing that that honor is about to be portrayed, or bestowed rather, on his enemy, the one that he wants to kill above all others, the one that he was about to ask, King, Would you allow me to hang this guy on the 75-foot tall gallows? Simple request first thing in the morning. Wait, what? Wait, who's supposed to do this? Who's supposed to do this? He is. And now you've got this sinking feeling in your stomach. You've got this dread in the pit of your stomach that says, oh my, I vastly miscalculated this one. You ever had that feeling? Where your stomach is tightening, where you just have the heart pounding in your ears. And I would imagine Haman at this point is feeling a little bit woozy. Are you kidding me? And yet, for his credit, he seems like he kept his composure, or maybe the king didn't notice the shock and awe on his face, but for whatever reason. Now, this day of, or morning decision has now led to a day of disgrace, a day of disgrace. Verses 11 through 14. So, Haman took the robe and the horse. He arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Once again, put yourself in the mindset and the character and the shoes of the character. What is Haman feeling at this point? What is he thinking about, perhaps? All right, so anger and being mortified. Humiliation, total humiliation. How do you suppose he said it? Thus shall it be done to the man to whom the king delights to honor. Thus shall it be done to the man who... There's a humiliation there. There's an anger there. What else are you thinking about? Retaliation. How can I turn this into a win? That would certainly be something that I would think of. What did you say, James? What's he going to do with the gallows? Thus shall it be done to the man to whom the king delights to honor. Here, Mordecai, we're taking a field trip. We're going to go over here. Oh, look at that pole. You see that right there? Why don't you get off and take a closer look? No, I mean, he can't do anything at this point. And so the question is, what do I do with that 75-foot tall gallows that I made? I think that I would probably be thinking about those people who for weeks and months and years even have watched every time Haman has ridden through the king's gates and have turned and looked at turned their heads and saw the silhouette of Mordecai standing there, not bowing down to him. And all of those people that have come and nudged him in the sides, and Haman, guess what? Mordecai is not bowing down to you still. You ever going to do anything about that? Oh yeah, it's coming. He's going to get his. You know, it's coming. That day's coming. That day's coming. And now all those people that perhaps have been watching for months and years at all this kind of kingly drama, this princely drama that's been taking place, are now seeing something brand new. It's not Haman now dragging Mordecai away to be hanged on the gallows, but it's Haman dragging Mordecai around on a horse and proclaiming, thus is the delight that the king has for the man he decides to honor. And now those people are kind of going, you see that? And they're perhaps having a good laugh at his expense. Can you imagine that? People don't like to be laughed at. People don't like to have people look at them. People don't like to be, as Doug said, humiliated. And that's exactly what's happening here. Haman had to physically go to the king's gates. And as he walks out, can you imagine everybody in the king's gate bowing down to him? And him going up to the very one that is not bowing down, taking him by the hand or taking him by the arm, and bringing him along. And perhaps the people in the king's gates are thinking, ooh, this is it. This is it. Mordecai is going to get his. He has this royal robe brought out and placed. He had to physically bring Mordecai into the king's palace. He had to physically put the robe on him while others are bowing down. He had to physically help him up and put him on the horse and crown him. And to make his humiliation total, the second part of chapter 11, or verse 11 says he had to take him around the square, through the streets of the city, shouting for the people to honor him and shouting for the people to bow down to him. The cruel irony of this is that which Mordecai was unwilling to do for Haman, Haman had to have others do for Mordecai. Mordecai was unwilling to bow down, right? Now he's the one sitting on the horse, and Haman is proclaiming as he's bringing this guy along, thus to whom it shall be for the man to whom the king delights to honor. And people are now bowing down before Mordecai. And then he had to physically take him back to the palace to take the robe off of him and return him to his place. Well, what does Haman do after that? He goes home. How does he go home? Verse 12. Mordecai just goes back. It's another day as usual, right? He goes back to the king's gates. That's where he was, and that's where he will continue to be, because he's close to Esther, closest probably he can get to right now. And he goes back to the king's gates to see, to just sit in his place. I kind of wonder what the conversations were like around that. Wow, Mordecai. Did you see that coming? Wow, Mordecai. Why did the king delight to honor you that way? Wow, Mordecai. How does it feel to have Haman lead you around on the back of one of the king's horses? How does it feel to wear a robe that was worn by the king? Well, there's a number of things that I would be thinking about as far as being Mordecai and what's happening at the king's gates, but it doesn't follow that. Who does it follow? It follows Haman. He's the main antagonist. He's the bad guy in the story. And so the question is, how did Haman return to his house? Well, that's all right. We'll get it another day. Honey, guess what? Disgrace. He was mourning, and what else does it say about him? He had his head covered. When you see those men who are arrested because they were found to be in acts of infidelity or perhaps in acts of betrayal against a company, and you know that the FBI has gone in and they've arrested the man, and he's coming out, and there's the news cameras and the TV cameras. What are they doing usually? Grab the coat and let's pull it up over my head. And I'm sure I've done that, but I feel like the illustration was worth it, so there you go. Pull up the coat over the head. I don't want anybody to see my face, and I want to get out of this as quickly as possible. That's one of the characteristics of total humiliation that Doug mentioned. Haman returned to his house mourning and with his head covered. What does he do after that? I got to tell my wife, I got to tell my family counselors. Completely demoralized that this Jew was the one that he had to honor. And what's the family's answer? This is interesting to me. What does the family say to him? This looks bad. This looks really, really, really bad. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him. Now the question is, contrast that back with chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. Here's the last time Haman went home. He was on cloud 9 because he was invited to a banquet which the queen and the king were a part of, and he was the only one that she invited. And as he's riding through the king's gates, again, everybody bows down except for the man that he's just had to honor. And it says that Haman restrained himself, and he went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife, Zeresh. Verse 11 of chapter 5, Haman told them all his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything which the king had done to promote him, and how he advanced him above all officials of the servants of the house. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king in the banquet she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited with her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the gate. What did his wife and friends say just a single day before there in verse 14? His wife Zeresh and Saul's friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it and go merrily with the king to the banquet. How different is this counsel now, half a day later, or a day and a half, well, I guess it'd be probably a day later, that they're giving him. Haman, I hate to tell you, but if Mordecai really is of Jewish descent, why didn't they say that the day before? Why didn't they say that the day before, do you suppose? when you have this counsel of toying with the idea of murdering somebody, and it doesn't seem like there's any kind of recourse or comeuppance, then it's a whole lot easier just to say what you're thinking and have people say, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. But when you've had an occasion where there is a total humiliation like what he's had here in chapter 6, then people begin to perhaps start thinking soberly. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall. It's almost like the wife and the wise men are kind of prophesying at this point to say, Haman, guess what? This is probably not done. Your humiliation and your the way you feel right now, you're not down at the bottom yet. You haven't reached rock bottom, so to speak. And the family is now offering him something completely different. I'm mindful of, you remember Gamaliel's advice there in Acts 4, Acts 5? About how whenever the apostles were standing there before him and they've sent them out of the chamber, and Gamaliel said, listen, if this revolt or if this new sect of the Jews, if they want to call it that, is of men, he said it's going to come to nothing. But if this is of God, he said, you don't want to stand against it because you'll be fighting against God. And he said, so just let them alone, because whatever's going to happen is going to happen. God's either going to exalt them or men are going to defeat this purpose that men have invented. And so Gamaliel's advice was really wise in that respect. It's interesting that they still beat the apostles and sent them out and told them not to preach anymore in the name of Jesus. But you find that his advice was similar to what they said. Listen, if Mordecai is a Jew, you're going to find yourself fighting against things that you can't understand. Then you're surely going to fall before him. Once again, God's name is not mentioned. However, if you were going to insert God's name somewhere in verse 13 in Zeresh's advice, where would you put it? Where would you put the name of God there, and if we were going to talk about this in terms of theology? Sorry, it's a long way from back there up here. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against God, but you shall surely fall before his God. That's where I would put it. Again, but realize that Esther is teaching about providence, and they seem to know something about God and his care and his concern for his people, even without mentioning his name. And lastly, after there was this ominous warning, again, where was all this counsel when he was toying with the idea of murdering all the Jews back in chapter 2? There is now a hastening of the judgment there in verse 14. While they were still talking, king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Well, maybe this day can still be salvaged. Even though I've had to parade around my enemy on his horseback, on the king's horse, that honor which I so richly deserved, maybe there's still a way that this can turn out for a positive. And he's going to hurry this morning, or he started out hurrying this morning to ask for the king to hang Mordecai. He hurried to obey the command in the king honoring Mordecai. He hurried when he came home with his tail between his legs, and now he's going to hurry to go to the last meal he would ever see. A day that started off with so much promise is not going to end well for this man. What are some lessons that you see here in this chapter? Things that we can talk about, things that we can notice as far as principles of providence, principles of people, principles that you see sometimes in you and me that we can see in these Bible characters that make it easier for us to see in you and me. All right. Todd bringing out lessons from other books of the Bible. Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Isn't that right? All right. In what ways do we see God's sovereign hand in this chapter? What ways can we point to and say, this seems like Again, that's all we have, because it doesn't say God moved the king to have a sleepless night. God moved Mordecai to come in. God moved Haman to, what do we see that might possibly put the hand of God on it? What do you see? Sleepless night, reading the Chronicles that we point out at the very beginning. Yes. What else? Haman was the first guy up that morning. Absolutely. What else besides the king? The lack of honor for Mordecai. Why did God wait 5 years to make sure that Mordecai got his reward for that? Okay, why did the king wait 5 years, or why was it overlooked for 5 years up until this point? What else? The pride that Haman had. Okay, he thinks that he's going to be honored, and God took that honor that he thought that he was going to get and gave it to the one who really truly deserved to be honored. Okay, what else? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Haman. Yep. So you have the yes men that are kind of going along with whatever's going on at the time, and yet you find that the yes men knew something about the fact that for Haman to fall so completely here in just, the span of what it seems like a morning. I don't know how long he had to parade around Mordecai on horseback, but this seems like at least a couple of hours. And, there you find, is God working through those men? Is God turning their counsel into bad counsel? Is God trying to help Haman to understand exactly what's going to come to him? Again, perhaps. Yes, sir. God is not, God is there in the long game, or God is playing the long game, if you will. And what Doug brings up is that God's plan started way, 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 way before this event here of chapter 6, and that's absolutely true. And as God is moving his pieces and as God is working his hand, he knows the end outcome. He knows that there is no choice but, submission, and the fact that his purposes are going to be done. And the people that try to stand in the way of that end up actually aiding those purposes and making his victory far more pronounced, far more evident, far more, the word I'm looking for is like glorifiable, but that's not a good word. Far more, I need another cup of coffee. There's a far more evident power that he has and he exudes in the life of men. Far more astonishing, that's the word. It's far more astonishing for us to look and say, it wasn't just that the king said, Haman, I'm looking for somebody to hang this morning. I'm going to put you up on the gallows. Oh, okay, why? It's the fact that Haman has to go through this humiliation the whole time that he's been trying to exalt himself, to the point where, again, you're astounded by the end of Esther to say, I can't believe that things worked out the way that they did. But the reason is because of what Doug brought out, that God is playing the long game. And that even though men seem like they have God in the corner and they have a victory over his people, God is still there. And what seems like victory for the enemies is going to turn out for defeat in the morning. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, sorry. Mm-hmm. All right. You still find the faith and the steadfastness of God's people. Even in the midst of what would be a horrifying thought to have one man issue the genocide of an entire group of people. And there's still the faithfulness to God that both Esther and Mordecai and the Jews there in Shushan that she told to go and fast. Tell them to fast for me. They all did. They fasted for 3 days before she went in to present herself before the king. You see an element of faithfulness all the way through, that God is not going to leave us abandoned. Mordecai even says, deliverance is going to rise from somewhere. We know that. We know God is going to take care of us. But you and your father's house are going to perish if you don't act in such a time. But who knows whether or not you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's exactly right. One of the things we can perhaps look at this morning as far as a couple of applications that I found is, number one, God is in charge of schedules. Again, how does providence work? How does providence work? God works on behalf of his people. How? I can't answer that. I can try and point to some certain events in my life where it seems like God's hand was involved in that aspect. But once again, for me to say, oh yeah, that was God working, is pretty presumptuous. Again, to look at those things and say, perhaps God was involved in that, is the best that I can do, unless God specifically says, this is the reason why I'm working. That's not providence anymore. That is providence, but that's God's telling you specifically, I'm involved in this. If I know God is involved in my life, if I know Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you, I'm with you always to the end of the age. I know that God is with me and God is working, but how does God's providence work? I believe there's a singular answer to this, and God's providence is working for the salvation of souls. God's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Listen, the job you have, the place where you live, the people that you're around, yes, absolutely, God may have put those people in your life providentially. However, what God is trying to do is accomplish his will in the earth, which is the salvation of souls. Somebody that perhaps you have in your path that you would have never had contact with otherwise. A person that you have influence with. A person that perhaps has come through a horrible set of circumstances to live in your house. And now you have an opportunity to shape them and to mold them and to help them understand the God of heaven, the one to whom we must all stand and give an account of ourselves. Romans 14, verse 12. How did that person come to live in your house? How did that person come to cross your path? How did that person come to be in your life? Who knows? However, what God is interested in is that person and their salvation, for them to come to know him and for the good of his people and for the salvation of his souls. Through chapter 6, the king's sleepless night, the book, the page, the discovery, all of those things were within the bounds of God's plan. Proverbs 16 verse 9 says, a man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. How does the Lord do that? I don't know. But I do know God is sovereign. God does rule in the kingdoms of men, and God is interested in the salvation of souls. The question is, how am I submitting to him, and how am I trying to advance his purpose for the salvation of souls and salvation of his people in my life, in the sphere of influence? Who knows? Maybe you were put in Rosenberg, Texas for such a time as this. Who knows? Maybe you're here when you could have been sleeping in this morning for Bible class. I hope not. But maybe you've just come to hear this lesson so that you can realize there's somebody in my life that needs to be influenced for the good of the gospel. Who knows? Maybe God, if I have a receptive heart, is using my open heart to realize that I can help somebody to understand the way of God better based upon hearing a lesson like this. God is in charge of schedules. Number two, I think you can see this clearly with Mordecai, that applause is not going to be something that changes the truly humble. Haman wanted everything that he said to the king of somebody to whom the king delights to honor. Maybe he wanted the throne for himself. Mordecai, sitting day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year in the king's gates, finished his rite of honor And where did he go? Back to the king's gates. When we're honored, when we are put in the limelight, so to speak, why do we do what we do? When we gain notoriety, do we like to hear the applause of others? Peach Valley, every evening, mercy, it's almost 2 weeks ago now. Every evening, what I would do is I would go around where all the kids were gathered there in the mess hall. It's not a very big mess hall, but I would say, is there somebody that you'd like to show appreciation to? Somebody that you'd like to thank for a great day, or for somebody that served you in that day? And the kids would go time after time and say, well, I appreciate this person because when I dropped my tray at lunch, they went down and they immediately got a broom and started helping me clean up. Well, I'm thankful for this person because when I was back doing KP, they went and they made my bed for me. Well, I appreciate this person because I was sitting alone on the playground. They came and they talked to me. And for those people that got to hear their names mentioned, hopefully that was a boost of encouragement for those people to hear their name and realize that they made a difference, that somebody noticed. Doesn't it help whenever somebody says thank you or somebody says I appreciate you? But one of the things I had to bring up one night, because there was a singular individual was being thanked over and over and over and over and over and over again. It was funny, and again, he's a remarkable personality, but he was being thanked over and over and over. And I kept wondering, if I was one of the ones that had went out of my way to do a great deed for somebody, to do a wonderful thing for somebody, and I'm just standing there in the evening circle just waiting to hear my name, and I never heard my name, how does that change me? Does that change me? Because sometimes people live for the applause, don't they? That's kind of what Haman's doing. Let me tell you, King, I've thought about this some. I think a royal robe ought to be brought and put on his back. I feel like he should be on a royal horse with a royal crest and have a royal prince and have a royal proclamation all the way through the city. I feel like that needs to be done so that person could say, oh, the king really appreciates this guy. King really loves this guy. How does applause change us? Jesus, in talking on the Sermon on the Mount, said in Matthew Chapter 6, verse 1, take heed that you don't do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them, otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Matthew 6, verse 5, when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites. They love to pray standing on the street corner in the synagogues that they can see seen by men. He says, assuredly I say to you, they have their reward. Matthew 23, verse 5, we talked about this last week. All of their works they do to be seen by men. A good deed shouldn't change who we are fundamentally, because we know that even if nobody else knows, who knows? God does. I don't have to say who knows, like Esther 4:17, but who knows? We know God does. And the good we do, he sees and he will reward. I think we understand this from this chapter. Sometimes rebuke and warning can often take subtle forms. I wonder if it went through Haman's mind as he's parading Mordecai around the city. Haman, get a clue that God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And God is certainly concerned about his righteous. And as he went throughout his day, the way his day went, this should have been a kind of a last wake-up call. The way that his wife and his friends warned him was a wake-up call. When you have people in your life that challenge your ideas and challenge your thoughts, and you have a wife or a husband that says, are you sure that's really a good idea? Are you sure that's really what God wants you to do? Are you sure that's what's going to glorify him most? Well, you just don't want me to be happy. You just don't want me to have anything, do you? Those may be subtle ways, maybe, that God is trying to wake us up and say, maybe you should make a different choice. Maybe you should reevaluate and think about the things that glorify him. Because the people in your life can absolutely tell you the truth. And we can be absolutely people that are unwilling to hear it because we've already got our own mind made up and we've got our pride and we just want to have things be the way they are. Something to think about. I'm thankful for you in Bible class this morning, being in Bible class this morning, and hope this has been helpful for you. We'll begin our worship here in just a few minutes. Thank you.